What is up, you guys? Welcome back to Tidal Gardens. So recently, we took down possibly the nicest show tank that we've ever built here at Tidal Gardens. So we broke down this Fimbriaphyllia show tank here. What made it one of the nicest aquariums that we've ever done? It was a really hard commit to a certain style and aesthetic. Now, originally, we called it the Euphilia show tank, and it was a mix of torches, frog spawn, and hammer. And generally speaking, you can kind of keep these guys together, but as stuff grows in, what tends to happen is that the torches start to get more aggressive and start stinging things like the hammers and the frog spawn. So in one fell swoop, we relocated all of the torches out, and this guy became a Fimbriaphyllia show tank. I personally absolutely loved this tank. Until the day that we took it down, it was doing fantastic. We had probably a dozen different types of hammers and frog spawn. They were growing in nicely. They were coloring up nicely. So you might be wondering, if it was so great, why did we take it down? The first reason is it basically had fully grown in. And that is typically not a problem, but corals, when they are fully grown out and they basically cannot grow any further, they do this thing where they shut down the growth. And you probably have noticed this on colonies where the internal polyps effectively have stopped growing and you really only get growth on the growth edge. If it's a problem at all, it's a first world problem. Too much growth, right? And at that point, it gets locked up. This tank was right about there. There are so many heads of Fimbriaphyllia in this tank that you can kind of tell that the growth rate is coming to a slow crawl and eventually would stop. Now, that kind of brings me to number two. One time, a piece of like our copper tone gold-ish hammer had broken off, and we decided to re-glue the one half of the colony and frag up the remaining other half. That remaining other half, we were able to cut it into what looks like 100 heads, and then it grew in explosively in that new tank because we went through that process of chopping it all into individual heads. Every single one of those heads exploded. Again, it's a good problem to have, but we were struggling to find space one time, and we just needed to offload a bunch of those to a wholesaler. As we were packing them, some of the single heads that we had grown out, no joke, were 20-something heads at the size that we were selling them. It was completely nuts. We kind of want to take this collection and give it that same opportunity to flourish. Third thing, although Fimbriaphyllia, it's not the most high maintenance thing in the world, it does require a tiny bit of maintenance, and show tanks tend to get neglected the most. Obviously, you really aren't seeing any symptoms of that. The tank is doing super well, but I think going forward, I wanted to do a tank that required slightly less maintenance even, or at least was that much more tolerant to neglect. Number four, sometimes it is just fun to redo things. This tank we have successfully run for what looks like 3 years now, and sometimes a change of pace is nice, not only just in like the creative sense, but also to get in there and to fully break down a tank. You're given an opportunity to clean up a lot of like systemic weirdness that might have been in that system. I'll give you one example. When a colony of branching hammers or frog spawn grow out, a lot of that growth is from buds at its base. And they do really well because those buds are protected by this canopy of stinging heads of hammer and frog spawn, right? And eventually those guys grow into full heads themselves. Guess what also benefits from the protection of a canopy of these hammers and frog spawn? Vermitid snails. And vermitid snails love to grow on the interior stalks of these corals. Now, it's not a huge deal because we can overload our tanks with bumblebees, and they've done a great job eradicating stuff. However, because it is such a great refuge for vermitid snails, it's outpacing the ability of these bumblebees to prey on them. So going through, cutting everything apart, knocking down all those vermitids, it helped a ton. And once we had all the colonies out of the tank, the remaining tiny bits of vermitid here and there that were on like the aquascape, gonzo in like 2 weeks. All right, so what have we done to replace that? Looking for something slightly lower maintenance, we decided to go with a different type of bubble tip anemone to kind of mirror the Colorado Sunburst anemone tank right across from it. The Colorado Sunburst tank, for a sec, that was kind of a mistake. Those Colorado Sunbursts escaped from a basket. We were originally thinking of maybe doing something like a Goniopora show tank with that system. And once those Colorado Sunbursts escaped, it was like, well, we'll just remove the Gonies. And then over time, that tank has become absolutely spectacular in its own right. The largest Colorado Sunburst in there is every bit of 12 to 15 inches maybe, fully extended. It could be, I don't know, the size of a large pizza. And the way that those tentacles flow in the water, the color of those anemones, magnificent. We wanted to make this tank a mirror to that, but with a different variety. So these guys here are Black Widow bubble tips. And originally we threw in Chicago sunbursts, but under this particular kind of lighting scheme, there wasn't a big enough contrast between those two. However, these guys with that punchy red and kind of that deeper purple base, it really does offset it design-wise. It's going to take a little bit of time for this guy to fill in compared to like the size of the Colorado sunbursts, but I can already tell that they are growing really nicely, and I fully expect that this tank will be every bit as stunning as the other. Now, a big benefit to that, again, I was looking for something lower maintenance, and going with something like a Goniopora show, that is not lower maintenance. However, anemones tend to be super low maintenance when it is just them in a tank. When you start to mix them in with stuff and they start to race around the tank, that can be a little bit more touchy. You have to move stuff around a lot. But if it's just bubble tips, you don't really have to do a lot. And so it is very neglect friendly. Down the road in one of these other show tanks, you have a bunch of empty show tanks right now. That could be the subject matter for maybe a true Euphyllia show tank with torches, or even, again, a Goniopora show tank that would be easier to maintain in a smaller size. This tank is about 250-ish gallons, I'm not really sure. Might be a little bit large to dedicate those types of corals to. The fifth and final reason why it was a fairly easy decision to take down that Fimbriaphyllia show is this right here. This is one of our farming tanks, and many of those corals have made its way into here. And while we really liked that aesthetic in the show tank, we've basically created it here in our farming system. Believe it or not, this is not all of the corals that were even in that tank. I would say that several of them are actually in another system altogether. We have sold God knows how many frags already. Still, this is what we're looking at. And there's so many heads of all of these different types of Fimbriaphyllia. I think it's just starting to get into growing out because we really haven't gone through and aggressively fragged anything. I'm sure that like this patch of this golden hammer here, this copper tone, if we decided to go in there and frag that down, no joke, I think we could get at least 500 to 1,000 heads. And yeah, 500 and 1,000 heads seems like two really different numbers. In practice, it's not. And each of those stalks is going to have a ton of like small little baby buds, and we're going to ignore it for a little bit, turn right back around, and it's going to be a 20 head single frag. It's going to be insane. When you have that type of explosive growth, and this tank here is 500 gallons versus about 250 in the previous show tank, this guy here is going to have that much more room to kind of cultivate that explosive growth. And when this thing really fills in, it is going to be this endless field of Fimbriaphyllia. Again, aesthetically, loved the show tank. I don't think we're going to miss it. All right, you guys, that does it from here. Hopefully the next time you see an update on this, everything will be that much more fleshed out and grown in. Until next time, happy reefing.